the worst thing you can do is do all of the things that are not the thing, but that are adjacent to the thing, right? Like a lot of writers go to writing workshops or meetups or conferences, or they take a bunch of online, courses and join communities and do all these things. And I just I hate all of that because it's not writing, right? It's like you have to actually do the writing. And then as you do it, you find little ways that it can be improved. And then you find ways to improve those little things. And then you just get better one little thing at a time. And you do that for long enough and you get pretty good.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Nat Eliason. Nat is a man of many talents. He's a blogger, a programmer, an entrepreneur, and most recently, he's the author of a book, Crypto Confidential. In the book, Nat tells the story, memoir style, of riding the crypto mania wave of 2021. He talks about how he learned how to invest in crypto. He talks about learning to become a crypto programmer and how he signed on to a project that made and then lost him millions of dollars. In today's episode, Nat and I go deep into his process of writing a book. We talk about why memoir-style writing is going to be an important form of information communication in the 21st century. We talk about why he feels like social media is mostly a waste of time and why he feels like books are such an important form of media, even in the age of the internet. We talk about how he's learned the skill of learning new things. And we talk about how and why he's building a patronage fund for his daughters as an alternative to college when they turn 18. I had so much fun talking to Nat, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Nat, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm so excited to talk about your book.
Yeah.
I love memoirs. I love them. And yours was very gripping. It was also very raw.
Yeah.
Was it hard to be that personal on paper about the ups and downs of your crypto journey?
Yes. There are definitely parts of the book that are very hard to reread and that were very hard to write. There was at least one time where I hit a period of writer's block because I knew what I had to write next. I knew what scene was coming, but I really didn't want to write it. And then eventually forced myself to write it. And I was sitting in a coffee shop, Palomino, right over here, trying to get through this scene. And then I get about halfway through it and I'm literally just crying in the cafe while I'm writing and couldn't quite stop myself and had to just leave. I had to run out the door because I was getting so embarrassed. I was like, okay, people are definitely starting to notice. I gotta get out of here. But I also feel like that's what makes it good, right? It seems like you enjoyed it. Our mutual friend, Paul Millard, he really enjoyed it. I've gotten really positive feedback on that aspect of the book in particular. Because if you're picking up a book about crypto, you don't expect it to have as much of an emotional component to it, but I feel like that was such an important part of that experience in that era that I wanted to try to capture that as best I could.
You seem so unafraid of being very raw. You're talking about the strain on your marriage from the work that you were doing in crypto. You're talking about huge wins, but also really devastating losses and things that you're describing the way it felt to make a mistake that looked very obvious after you had made it, but was not obvious at the time, that cost you tens of thousands of dollars. That has to be really hard to put down on paper.
It is really hard. And I think it's one of your most important jobs as a writer to let people know they aren't alone. And everybody has these different insecurities, fears, failures that they carry around inside of them. And they wonder on some level if they're the only one because we don't like to talk about it. And I think part of what makes good writing great, or great writing great, is if you can let somebody out there know that they weren't the only ones feeling these things, or they weren't the only ones making these mistakes. And one of the things I've heard from other people in crypto who read it is a bit of like a relief, a catharsis. Oh man, I had this problem in my relationship too, or I made mistakes like this too. And there is that shame and embarrassment that goes with it. That again, it's like a lot of people don't like how they got wrapped up in the crazy gambling, money addictedness of that era. And there is a little bit of that embarrassment or whatnot that comes from it. And I felt like being really honest about that part too was super important. While also having the fun ride, right? Like, I don't want it to seem like this is a really sad
No,
downer of a story,
it's
but
not. It's a
yeah,
page
yeah,
turner.
yeah. Thank you.
And I mean, it sounds like a thrilling ride.
Yeah,
But you're very honest about both the ups and the downs. It's the kind of thing that would be very easy to just paint the good sides,
totally.
and you were very unafraid of talking about both sides of the story, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
How did the book come to be? Because it's very nicely packaged. You had this like perfect like year-long experience.
Yeah.
It all like it feels like you went in trying to like, I'm just gonna like have an experience that would make a perfect book, and then I'm gonna write about it.
It feels that way a little bit looking back at it. And without spoiling anything, a couple of the twists in the book feel like they should have been in a movie script or something, right? Like they were just almost too perfect of little things to happen to make a good story. And I mean, 80% of it is if you take a year and a half of your life in some very stressful, fast paced environment, and then you only select the 15 most exciting pieces of that period, you'll often be able to find a pretty exciting story, right? Because there are whole months where basically nothing happened that just didn't make the cut. So that helps a lot, being able to remove things. But the other part was just getting lucky, right? Like I said, this crypto thing is taking off. I want to try to make a lot of money really quickly on it. I'm going to dive in and see what I can do. And being both on the really like gambling, speculative side of it, as well as actually learning the programming to work with a team and see that side of it, that combination let me see both sides of a lot of what was going on in the industry. And then combine that with, again, getting lucky with a few random big things happening that created a good story out of it. And then having a bit of writing experience beforehand so that I could go and then try to pull a good story out of it. It all just ended up kind of working out really well.
How much perspective did you need after things started to settle down before you were ready to start pulling out the story and turning it into a book?
Yeah, that's a good question. It started as one thing. It started as a lot more of a here's what's been going on, right? So maybe a better analogy here is you think of Michael Lewis writing The Big Short, where he was looking at big players in the space and what they were doing during that period and pulling a story out of a collection of other people's experiences. And in the beginning, I wanted to do more of that because I felt like, well, there's obviously everything going on with SBF and FTX. There's some of this finance stuff. There's what's going on in DeFi, there, decentralized finance. There's everything with like Ethereum and Solana and Avalanche and all these different chains. And I had been writing articles about what was going on and trying to explain the space, make it more approachable to outsiders. And those articles had done really well. And that was what gave me the initial idea. I had one person who read them who messaged me and he said, this actually reminds me of reading about the mortgage-backed security crisis in '08, just debt on top of debt on top of debt and how quickly everything can fall apart. And that kind of gave me the first inkling. But as things unwound and fell apart through 2022, I'd already started on the book proposal at that point, and I had found an agent and was working on it. And I sort of realized that, one, I'm not a journalist. I have no aspirations to be a journalist, and I'd much rather let a journalist do the outside view of this world and what was going on. But what I did have was this very unique insider experience. Actually, not even that unique of an insider experience, but I had a substantial enough insider experience and the ability to write about it, which most people working in crypto probably didn't. And so that felt like this would be the book of this period I could do that maybe nobody else could really do, between like having the experience, being willing to write about it, and being willing to write about it very honestly. Um, and so then it just became way more personal, stripped out all of the other stories, right, of the big things that were going on. I knew Michael Lewis was doing the FTX book. I figured I don't need to touch this. Like he can handle I don't want to compete with him. Um, and I'll just focus on this kind of crazy story and let people see behind the curtain of what was going on amongst the people who they probably didn't hear about in the news.
I think one of the interesting things about that approach is you're in the book, you're referencing things that are happening and you're referencing news stories, but only in the context of your own experience of
Yeah.
them, which really drops the reader down into the present. It's so easy to read a book and see the big picture and kind of divorce yourself from the reality of what it's like to have been there, because all of a sudden you have this omniscient view of
Yeah.
what's going on and how all the pieces fit together. And because you're not trying to get into any of that, you're only referencing things in the context of how you engaged with them and how they affected you, and only with the knowledge that you had at the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really powerful way to tell the story.
Thanks.
I think the world needs more memoirs. I think this is such an important way of communicating human experiences and human life trajectories that are sometimes more useful.
Yeah, we could talk about this topic for a while. I feel
Let's do
really,
it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've had this period of very tactical self-help business nonfiction, pop psych, and I feel like it's getting a little tired for a couple reasons. One being that it's so done and formalized, and you can there's a very clear structure that you follow to do a pop self-help style book, and you have the little story and the explainer and the takeaway at the end. And I think that format, when it's done well, is fantastic. It's incredible, right? Like Psychology of Money, Atomic Habits, some of these big books in the space do that so well. But when everybody's doing that format, it starts to get kind of tired. And to your point, you're having this high level omniscient view of the topic that you're not getting as personal of a relationship with. Whereas with a memoir style story, you can still convey one or two big ideas, but through a very personal experience that the reader hopefully ends up actually internalizing a lot more. And if you think about how we taught this stuff for all of history, it was always through stories. Always. It was never, it wasn't like Homer writing down a bulleted list of here's how you be like an honorable soldier or whatnot, right? You had these epic stories. And I think that's really what people resonate with more. And we've been kind of duped into this idea that we can just read a bulleted list of things to do and then we'll just do them. But I think really that gets forgotten. It kind of needs to be wrapped up in a story for it to stick.
It's also harder for it to translate because the bulleted list can be nice to reference. Like
Yes.
there are books that I have read that have been very formative. They're giving you more list style principles and ideas. But I feel like in so many ways, the day-to-day challenge is figuring out how you translate that into an actual life.
Yeah, I agree.
Because life is not formulaic.
No.
It doesn't follow a 10-chapter format that so many of these books default to. And so you can read all of this stuff and internalize it, but then it's not like it doesn't account for how messy the individual human experience is.
Totally.
Whereas a memoir is something that you can go in and you can read and you can start to pull out elements that feel like they relate to your life, even if it's not directly, but you also see the mess of it.
Right.
And I feel like in some ways that's more valuable. I think that's the same reason why people love novels so much.
Yeah.
And historically why novels have been a core part of the Western canon. You'd think it would just be philosophy, but like the novels and the stories are in there too. And it's because I think we need them.
I mean, the novels and stories sell way better.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people actually sit down and read philosophy text or something, but they will download the same idea when it's conveyed in a really good story. And so I do think that that's in some ways the much more important skill to develop is the really good storytelling and how to package these ideas into a great story, because the number of people who can enjoy and get through and put to work getting the direct advice right out to them is very few, right? And your advice is probably not going to spread, or your ideas are not going to spread very far if you only package them that way.
You mentioned that novels sell better than philosophy books,
Yeah.
but books in general are a tough sell in the face of like visual media, podcasts, television. I'm sure you think about this a lot as an author. Do you think that this applies also to like how we communicate stories, not just through writing, but also through like podcasts and video? Or is this a triggering question as a writer? I want to hear your take on this.
It's not a triggering question. The reason I'm reacting the way I am is that that's actually not true.
Mhm.
If you look at the charts of book sales, they've been going up the last few years, and they're basically reaching all-time highs now. People are buying more books.
Do you have a hypothesis on why?
I think people are tired of screens.
I'm tired of screens.
Yeah.
I'm so over them.
I mean, you look at how much fantasy and romantasy and all of them have resurged. Obviously, there's the whole nonfiction industry that's taken off like a lot more in the last 10, 15 years. But really just like across the board, people are reading more books, buying more physical books. Physical books have taken back over more sales relative to Kindle. And then on top of that, you have audio, right? And audiobooks, depending on the book, might be 30, 40, 50% of the sales. And so if you write a book, it now can be turned into this other asset that sells incredibly well because so many people love audiobooks that I actually feel like it's, if your goal is to convey ideas or tell stories through writing, the only thing you should be really focused on is books. Because like, or I mean, well, it depends on how much of a patience you have for like the ephemerality, right? Because there'd be a good case for something like making YouTube videos, right? But even, will the best YouTube video ever made today, will that still be watched in 10 years? Probably not. But the best books written today will definitely still be being read in 10 years, right? It has this incredible longevity to it. And I think that the more we do live in this fast-paced, ephemeral information environment, I don't think that the proper response is to give in and create ephemeral things. I think it actually creates even more of an advantage to create long-term things that can last, because it's kind of like crypto, right? Like everybody's chasing the shiny new, potentially super valuable, like boom, you could hit 200,000 subscribers overnight, whatever thing. And they're not chasing this other thing, which could still be, being printed or making them money in 10, 20 years. And so, as somebody who wants to put their ideas out, I actually think there's almost never been a better time to focus on doing book length projects instead of trying to write great tweets, trying to write great LinkedIn posts, all of this stuff that is literally going to disappear tomorrow and nobody's going to remember it.
How do you think about the relationship between more ephemeral content and written like long form books? Because you've done both extensive. Well, you've done the ephemeral content extensively, and there is some relationship to it. Like it's easier to sell a book if you have a big audience.
It is and it isn't, right? Like the thing that yes, I've figured out how to do the ephemeral content well and grew Bookstagram while I was working on Crypto Confidential, and I've been on Twitter for forever and have a decent following there. And so I kind of know how to do the ephemeral content, but where I eventually landed was, has anybody ever had a best-selling book with no social media presence? Of course, tons of people, right? Because other people with social media presences can talk about your book. It doesn't have to be you. But has anybody ever had a best-selling book without like writing the book and by focusing on ephemeral content instead? Like, no, of course not, right? And so the thing that I keep coming back to is, okay, I could take this 2 or 3 hour chunk of my day and I could put that towards making more TikToks, making more Instagrams, making more whatevers to feed the algorithms. Or I could put that towards getting better at writing book length products, right? Or like actually working on the ones that I'm writing, or just like relaxing and going for a walk so that the ideas can percolate. And in the short term, that feels like the wrong decision because I'm not seeing my followers go up. I'm not getting all these comments and engagement. I'm not getting, stopped at the coffee shop by somebody saying, "Hey, you're like the book guy, right?" Like, that's cool, right? I like that. But, what really made me realize this was last Thanksgiving. And I'd I'd been really diligent about my TikTok, my Instagram, my YouTube, and I was getting all this book content out. And then over Thanksgiving, I didn't have that much time because my family was in town, kids were off from preschool, right? Like pretty busy. And because I was so committed to staying on top of my publishing schedule, I put the book work I was doing on the back burner and focused on the YouTube and Instagram stuff. And after that week, I said, that was a huge mistake. Like, that's not what I should be focusing on. Because in 3 or 4 years, the thing that's going to give me the career I want, the satisfaction, is this big long-term project. But when you could be publishing something every week, every day, right, and getting likes and feedback and all of that stuff on it, it feels like you're doing something really important, even if you're kind of not, right? Like there's a balance there, right? And I think that, for me, that's the case because for me, the thing is books, right? But if your thing is YouTube, then like, yeah, you should be doing the YouTube. If your thing is podcasts, you should be doing the podcast. It's just really important to be honest about what the thing is for you and not do a separate thing thinking it's the thing.
It's very Stephen Pressfield of you.
Yeah,
Don't let the resistance.
The shadow career.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I actually like Turning Pro better than War of Art.
Really? Why?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the idea of resistance in War of Art is like fantastic. It's a wonderful term, and his ability to coin that and put that in all of our heads, super powerful, super useful. I resonate more with the challenge in Turning Pro because I don't have that much trouble being productive. I can, chase after a goal and I can, move towards it, whatnot. But I definitely have trouble with going after a different goal than the big goal, right? And this like building up a book talk instead of working on my book is the perfect example of it, right? Where I could have learned even more about writing and gotten even further on like my sci-fi novel or getting more reps into Crypto Confidential last year. But I really wanted to chase this like shadow career of being an Instagram influencer around books. And so I spent a ton of time on that path too. And so the idea in Turning Pro that you're going to have these shadow careers that tempt you away from your main thing, I find so powerful because I see it in myself. I see that desire in myself all the time. And you can start to see it in some other people too sometimes, right? Where they're doing awesome on this one path. They're going so well. And then they get distracted by a shiny object. And you're like, no, like, don't give into it. Keep going. You're gonna get it. And sometimes they come back, and sometimes they don't. I had this conversation with my friend once because he was working on something he was really excited about, but it was a very long-term project, scary, challenging, unsure if it's going to succeed. And somebody came to him with this incredible job offer, and we're talking about it, and he's like, this is such a cool opportunity. I'm, so excited for it. The pay is going to be great. And I was like, look, dude, you've never once told me you were excited about doing venture capital, right? Like, you're just scared about continuing to go after this big thing that you really want. And so you're jumping onto this. And I think he wasn't super happy with me when I said it. But then he came back a day later and said, yeah, that was the right call.
How do you think about discerning what is the shadow career versus the real thing? Because sometimes it's not super obvious. Sometimes the shiny thing, like our brains are very good at logic.
Totally.
It's really good to rationalize your way into like, well, this makes sense. And maybe this is the way that I'm supposed to be helpful in the world. And I imagine this is a thing, like I know you've had a lot of different stages throughout your journey. I imagine this is a thing you've had to ask yourself many times as you've moved between projects. How do you think about it?
I think Pressfield gives the best advice on how to find it, which is what is the work you would be most afraid of failing at, right? Like for me, there was a point where I was thinking about joining a crypto VC firm. And if in 50 years I was not a great crypto VC, I would not give a shit. I would not care at all if I failed at that job. And another one for me is programming. I really enjoy programming. It's really fun. It's very satisfying. But if in 50 years nobody knew me for my programming, I wouldn't care. It doesn't matter to me. Like I don't have any emotional attachment to success in that area. But if I wrote for 50 years and never sold many books and nobody knew of me as a writer, I would really feel like a failure. I would really feel like I had screwed up my life in some meaningful way. And that's really scary, right? Because by doing the thing, you are opening yourself up to that feeling because you might fail. Maybe more than half of people who pursue a lot of these things fail, especially with something like writing or music or acting or one of these extreme tail careers. 99% of people who go after it aren't going to be able to pay their mortgage with it, right? And so by committing to it, you're risking feeling that total failure. But that risk is also the best sign that that's probably what you should be doing. And so for me, going after the Instagram followers, or for me trying to build a YouTube, all of those things are fun ways to make numbers go up and feel good about myself and feel like I'm making progress on something. But if I never become a YouTube influencer, I literally could not care less. Like, it doesn't matter to me. So it's not what I should be focusing on.
Do you think about the sort of like different types of influence that you can have with something like a book?
Yeah.
Like, because I feel like there is a meaningful difference between writing a book that gets national mainstream attention,
Totally.
it's on a bestseller list, like that's such an obvious success. I think that's what every writer dreams about. But you also can write a book that is not widely read, but is read by people who are influential and who it influences. Do you think about that at all when you're thinking about like, what does success mean as a writer? Like,
Yeah.
how do you, is that even a question that feels relevant to you?
No, I think it's a really important question. I think that in any type of work that you're doing or anything that you're doing, you do have to really know what game you're playing. Because if you think you're playing one game, but you're playing a different one, you're going to lose and you're going to be really disappointed and confused about why you lost.
Yeah.
Yes. Like, this isn't fair, right? And so, with Crypto Confidential, my primary goal was to write a really entertaining story. I just wanted something that would be very fun, very exciting, and would educate people about that time period as a bonus. And with that goal, it required writing the story in a very specific type of way, right? Like, I was studying John Grisham, right? And Red Rising, and like these types of books that just pulled you through them were so exciting. I wasn't studying, an O'Reilly guide to writing Ethereum smart contracts, right? Because that's like the exact opposite end of the spectrum. That is pure knowledge transfer and incredibly boring, but very effective at doing that job. And so if you're going for this mass market, like big success, you have to write a book in a way that it can appeal to a mass market, right? Which usually means it has to be a really exciting page turner. It has to be really, really fun, right? Like a Sarah J. Maas ACOTAR is not going to have the literary density of Dostoevsky, right? But it's not supposed to, because most people don't want to read that, right? They want something fun and enjoyable and exciting they can talk about with their friends. And so if that's what you're aiming for, then you really have to be willing to write in a way that will work for that goal. And for me, I had to learn a whole new style of writing because I didn't know how to do it. And that was a whole fun journey of its own. But if I had tried to write the very argumentative, this is why Bitcoin's important, this is why Ethereum is important, and then it wasn't in airports or getting talked about on like fun podcasts and things, and I was disappointed, then I would have completely lost the plot, because there's no way that that book ever becomes a mainstream like airport read success. It's just a totally different style.
Today's episode is brought to you by the John Galt Mortgage Company. I am not currently in the market for a house, but when I am, I will absolutely be working with the John Galt Mortgage Company, which was started by my friends Mitch and Tim earlier this year. Mitch and Tim have been working in the real estate world for years, and they realized over time that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. Most real estate agents don't even realize how much extra profit is baked into the cost. So Mitch and Tim decided to build a new kind of mortgage, one where they voluntarily cap their own profit on every transaction and pass the savings along to you, the buyer, in the form of a lower interest rate. When I'm buying a house, I will absolutely be working with them. And if you're in the market for a house, you should too. You can find more about what they're doing at johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find a link to their site down in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. I have a very loosely held hypothesis that
Okay.
I want to run by you and see what you think about
Hit me.
this. I feel like memoirs are going to become more important
Mhm.
in the 21st century. And I think that that is true because the world is becoming more fragmented in terms of possibilities. There are just more options. There's more room to choose your own adventure. More is available at your fingertips. And I don't think that just explanation books on here's how building a social media brand works, here's how becoming a YouTube influencer works, here's how building a cryptocurrency works. I can teach you about like the know-how of different possible paths that you can follow. I don't think that that can give people the creative spark that they need to be able to start to envision multitudes of possible life paths that they could choose from. I think the memoirs are the thing that sort of cracks the creative code in showing you that the world is infinitely variable and so many different people are having wildly different experiences, and you can get creative about what type of work you want to do, what type of lifestyle you want to lead, what you value, what you want to build your life around. I feel like memoirs are more and more going to become the cheat code as it becomes easier and easier to actually say, you know, I want to do something different, and then nothing's stopping you. Like if you have a laptop, you can go do whatever.
Yeah.
And I think the memoirs are what sort of makes that possible.
I'll take it a step further, and I'll say that I think almost anything under the how to live umbrella will trend more towards memoir over the near future. And I say that because for the last 20 years, 15 years, the trend has been towards what we could call like scientism, where this is going to be a book on how to think. And in the book on how to think, I'm going to tell you a bunch of studies about people thinking in different situations. And these ones made good decisions and these ones made bad decisions. And therefore, like based on this scientific research, you should make this decision. And we have a few things going on now, right? Like one, there's this big reproducibility crisis, right? Where all of these studies that informed these pop psych books end up getting thrown out 5 or 10 years later. And this even happened to Kahneman on some of his work. And so people have this kind of new skepticism, right? Where they open a book on how to live or how to think, and it says, studies say, studies say, studies say, studies say. And I think I think people are developing a reaction now where they say, well, what do you think? Right? Like I bought this book because I trusted you, the author, to give me some perspective. I think people are smart enough to read from a few sources at least, not just download one as their, manual for life. And so they're much more interested in what the author thinks. They don't want the author to hide behind a bunch of different studies and examples. They want them to just give them an opinion. And in terms of giving the opinion, it works way better in a personal story. And it's funny because you would think, in terms of like being rational, that we would trust a bunch of data or a bunch of examples more. But I think we actually trust the personal story more. And that's often construed as a bad thing, that you shouldn't just listen to anecdotes, that you should, trust the data and whatnot. But I'm not sure that's good advice, especially when it comes to like how to live, because the data strips out all of the context. It removes everything about the full experience of the advice, like you were talking about earlier, right? How the memoir brings in all of that richness. But if you can get a few good stories from people about living these types of lives or going through these types of challenges, you can form your own interpretation of how to live your own life based off that and have a much richer understanding of the examples that have informed that. So I totally agree. I think for a lot of this genre of book, I think it'll move much more in that memoir direction. I think the most popular ones especially will be there, because there is also this element of people writing books about things they don't totally understand just because they like found a bunch of data on it. And you can kind of feel that sometimes. But when somebody's really, really lived something and really, really understands it, they can explain it in a way that you can tell is super resonant for them. And that's why it works so much better than the derivative versions. I mean, I think the 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss is sort of the perfect example of this, because he almost exclusively used stories from his own life and him figuring these things out and doing all these things. And then a lot of the derivative work for yourself entrepreneurship books pulled a bunch of stories from other people or had a much shallower version of their own experience. And so none of them did as well because none of them had that depth of personal connection with the author's experience that he had.
This is one of the things that I run into a lot in the work that I do with education and like alternatives to public school.
Yeah.
So many people want data and they just argue in numbers. And there's tons of data about outcomes in public school, outcomes in different types of private schooling models, homeschooling. Like the data's all out there. But I've always just balked against arguing in numbers because it feels so antithetical to the entire point, which is that your kid is not just a data point. Like your kid's not a number. You're not a number. Just because something statistically works out for people, like that's the wrong way to think about setting up your kid's life. And it's the wrong way to think about setting up your life. And I've always found the anecdotes so much more compelling, which is part of why I started a podcast. So I could talk about people's anecdotes and hopefully people find them useful. I feel like so many of the choices that I've made in my life have been like all of the big junctures and crossroads where I've had to make a meaningful choice about, am I going to take path X or path Y? And path X might be very well traveled and it's the safe path, but path Y is the one that speaks to my soul. And I go looking for not data about, 75% of people who took path X were successful, whereas only 3% of people who took path Y were successful. Like, I don't care about the statistics.
Yeah.
I want to go read somebody's story about how they grappled with the decision between path X and path Y and why they chose path Y and what it looked like for them. And I care in some ways less about their successes and failures and more about the journey they were on and how they thought about it. And I have used that to make personal decisions in my life far more times than I have used, what does the data say and what do the studies say? Like, I don't care. I could be the anomaly in the study, Like I'm just a singular person.
I really think that people don't actually make decisions based off data. They make an emotional decision and
they
then
make arguments. They're like, I'm right. See?
Well, yes. They make an emotional decision and then they find data to back it up or data to give them permission to do what they wanted to do anyway. Right. And that might be the worst thing you could do. Right. Imagine somebody who's in a marriage that's struggling and they say, well, the data says that 60% of marriages end in divorce. And so this is just normal. And like, we should just be okay getting divorced. That's actually a much worse way to look at it than something like, no, like you fix your marriage no matter what, right? Like those kinds of rules or, guidelines are actually much more powerful than I think looking at just like a bit of data to make a decision, right? It's so easy to trick yourself into thinking you're being rational when I don't really think anybody is ever rational in the way that we use the word, right? It's something that they just tell themselves after they've already made an emotional decision.
I'm laughing because that's a well-framed example, but it's also very sad and it's also very true. I think you're making a really good point. This is a very half-baked hypothesis, but do you think that the rise in popularity in the like pop psych and how to think book category corresponds with the rise of things like Google and social media and the fact that people sort of have this intuitive understanding that like I kind of need to know how to think because there's a lot of information getting thrown at me and I have to know how to dissect it, or is that coincidental?
Interesting. I mean, I think that when people read these books, they're not like, I'm not sure anybody cares that much about how to think. It's sort of a secondary thing from either like how to get rich or how to be happy, which is, I mean, how to get rich is its own thing below how to get happy, right? Like
less moral, how do I think well, and more practical, like how do I get what I want in life?
Because I don't think most people are reading a pop psych book so they can do better at a debate tournament. They're reading it because they feel like there's something in their life that isn't what they think it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And they get on this nonfiction train because they think that if they find the right nonfiction book with the right mental model or cognitive trick, then that will solve all of these problems in their life, or it will solve this like imaginary barrier in their life. And occasionally you do find one that ends up being super useful in some very important way. But most of the time, it's this form of procrastination. And really, it's a way to avoid doing the big hard thing that you already know you need to do, but don't want to do. And so you are looking for an easy cheat code to get around it.
A shadow career as a reader.
A shadow career is, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Or I mean, just I feel like the easiest one is you think about like getting broadly in shape, right? Like losing weight or getting stronger. Like you know what you need to do. Like you can quibble over which diet or whatnot, but like you need to eat less and work out. And if you like do those two things, it's gonna get you 80% of the way there. But if you're following hundreds of Instagram accounts trying to find like, oh, okay, do I do like keto at 80% fat or 85% fat? Or like you're getting super, super minuscule on these things, you're collecting information to procrastinate. Right. And you're just like trying to avoid doing the big hard thing by looking for these easy answers. And I think a lot of the self-help nonfiction genre is just giving these people excuses for inaction by reading more books and looking for more answers when they already have the answers right in front of them.
How much of social media do you think is just a distraction versus people creating content that actually is useful? I ask this as somebody who's very chronically online doing things that I hope are useful, talking to people about different modalities of education and, promoting longer form content like this conversation. I know you're using it to promote your book. Do you have a sense of the split between how much of it is actually helping people versus how much of it is just feeding into people's, I'm getting a little dopamine hit from this. I don't have to actually do something meaningful today?
I mean, I don't know where to draw the line exactly, but I am pretty much of the opinion that it's much further on the entertainment side than the education side than most of us want to admit to ourselves, right? And like including this conversation, right? Like because I think that for me listening to a podcast like this, it's mostly because I'm interested in these stories and they're fun and I'm going to learn a little bit about you and about me and I'm going to get to go on this journey with the hosts and I might get a little bit here and there about writing or storytelling or self-improvement or something, but I'm mostly doing it because I enjoy that type of media, right? Like it makes me happy, right? It feels good like when I'm on my commute. I really, really enjoy it. And I think that what you want to avoid is thinking that a lot of ephemeral stuff is like the best way to learn something, right? Just in the sense of if your goal is really, really, really to learn how to write a better story, there are like wonderful textbook style books that will give you that information as directly as possible. And getting the higher level from listening to people talk about it in casual formats, it'll give you some, but it's mostly because you enjoy hearing about that stuff. And it's kind of like fun to listen to it. Right. And same thing with like Instagram, like let's take health accounts on Instagram, right? It's like a lot of that I think is more entertainment than educational, right? Just because people enjoy that type of content. They enjoy watching it and they enjoy consuming more of it. Like masterclass is maybe the perfect example of this because like nobody's learned how to play basketball watching a masterclass with Steph Curry, right? Like that idea is absurd. You might get little tips from it. You'll get a little bit, but it's mostly that you kind of like feel good while you're watching it. It's entertaining. Or like Duolingo, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar company that, as far as I can tell, has never actually taught somebody how to speak a language. Like it's you get the dopamine hit of going through the exercises and you learn a little bit, but like you have to go actually talk to people face to face to learn the language, right? There's a lot of stuff I think that's on this spectrum of like edutainment. And if we're being honest about like the game we're playing and what we're doing, then it's okay to actually be more entertaining and to be more fun and to lean into that and to not feel like you need to give people a textbook every time you like make a reel or record a podcast episode or something like that.
I do think just based on my own patterns of following threads of information over the
Mhm.
course of my time on social media, so from like late high
Yeah.
school onward, I do think that there is something like an argument to be made that social media and other forms of ephemeral content are also launch pads into
Mm.
bigger ideas. Like
Yes. I
I
like
think
that.
they
Yeah, yeah.
are the exposure component is very significant.
Yeah.
And I think because it's sort of like opening social media is sort of like opening a curated Google to
Mhm.
some extent, where you've instead of typing in a question, you've sort of curated both people you're following, but also algorithmic knowledge
Yeah,
about
yeah.
what you're interested in, what you like. And then it sort of offers you a bunch of different possibilities of things you could learn about. And I'm giving it a very generous spin. Like
No,
sometimes
no.
if you've trained your algorithm poorly, you're going to get a bunch of junk that's just, I don't want to think about anything. This is like a good distraction until I have to go back to the work that I don't want to do. But you can, if you're using it well, it can be trained on a lot of things that are actually useful. And then you might scroll through it and none of it's interesting, but you might also see something that actually sparks your interest, and then you want to go down the rabbit hole, and then you follow the thread of curiosity and you start Googling things, you start reading articles, you go find a book. And sometimes to have meaningful benefit, you don't even have to go that deep. Like I've gotten all kinds of sort of short form value from
Yeah.
things I've seen on the internet. Oh, that's actually like a really good idea. I'm going to organize my drawers better so that it takes me less
Yeah,
time to
yeah.
find things, like little things like that. But also it can be very useful in that way.
Totally. And I think that actually perfectly highlights why it feels like, at least I have liked social media less
Mhm.
and less over the last few years, because it feels like it used to be that way. Right? Let's go all the way back and think about RSS, right? When we had an RSS feed of all of our favorite blogs,
Yeah.
and just the articles came through and you could open them up and decide if you wanted to read them or not, and then go on to the next one. And there was nothing algorithmic in there. There was nothing from anybody that you didn't opt into. You found new blogs by following links on the blogs you were already reading,
Mhm.
and it had this wonderful discoverability component to it. And then you think about Twitter. For most of Twitter's life, you could put a link in your tweet and it wouldn't be punished for that, right? That was a normal way to use Twitter. And yes, there was a lot of self promotion, but it was also a wonderful way to discover things. And now, not only is linking out being punished on all these platforms, right? Like if you have a link in your tweet, nobody sees it. If you say link in bio in your TikTok or Instagram reel, it doesn't seem to spread as far, right? Like, every platform wants to keep you on that platform. But now on top of that, you're not even getting stuff from the people you follow anymore. You're just getting algorithmic stuff where, on TikTok, you could have 100,000 followers or something, but if your video doesn't hit the algo, it only gets seen by a couple thousand of them. And so we can't even use social media for that anymore because the people we opted in to follow aren't even getting shown to us in favor of, the latest like silly video or whatever's going
Mhm.
viral. And I feel like that's where it's gotten harder and harder for it to feel like as good of a top of funnel information source. Because I mean, for years that was how I got my blog out there, and I've been doing my blog for 11 years, 12 years, and Twitter and Reddit, and then we're always great for it. But now it's at this point where it just doesn't feel worth it to even like try on some of these platforms anymore for building a newsletter because they just want to keep you there. And it's been kind of this sad thing where it feels like newsletters are dying a little bit because the discoverability has decreased so substantially. I will add one thought on that though,
Yeah, do.
which is like the one counter to that supports your point about discoverability,
Yeah.
and back to the idea that people are reading more books.
Mhm.
The amount of book discovery that does happen on Instagram and TikTok is pretty cool. Like the people who are talking really excitedly about books they're reading or about movies they watched or long form interviews they listened to. And that type of unlinked discoverability does seem to be happening. And that's really neat. And that's something that I think a lot of marketers, like internet marketers, are sleeping on because they feel like if they can't track an attribution, it doesn't count. But I think almost all marketing now is going to be unattributable because it's just word of mouth on these short form video platforms mentioning things. And then you see huge spikes in sales or traffic or whatever, but you can't directly tie the two. Somebody has to know that that happened in order to let you know that it happened. This happened with me with doing my TikTok videos where I I made a video about a book that I really, really liked, and the video got over 1 million views, and it drove a apparently pretty substantial number of Audible sales for the book. And the guy who ran the author's marketing emailed me a few days later and said, "Hey, we've basically been spending the last couple of days trying to figure out where all these sales came from." And then somebody sent us your video and we're like, "Oh, cool." But like that was really neat because this one TikTok video with no link in it, just talking about the book, had driven a big enough spike in sales for them to notice it on their end, but they had no way to attribute it. And so they had to like go back and figure it out. And that seems like the billboard era or something, right? But we've actually just kind of like gone full circle to back to word of mouth and away from, direct linking, direct links and tracking and all the stuff that we haven't liked about maybe the last 10 years of social media era.
You mentioned earlier, you were talking about different ways of learning new things. And you were talking about your own processes of how you've learned things, which is one of the things I thought was really interesting about your book is over the course of the story, you're learning multiple very complex skill sets. And it's very obvious in the way that you tell the story that this is a thing that you had done before. Like you knew how to go learn a new programming language, learn how to go write contracts. You knew how to go like for a new cryptocurrency. You knew how to go figure out like, okay, there's something going on with NFTs. I'm going to go like learn the whole landscape and figure out how to navigate it so I can make money with NFT launches. This is clearly a thing that you have done a lot of, and I want to talk about how you approach learning new things because I get the sense that you've spent a lot of time mastering this as a skill set.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for picking up on that. It's something that I never liked school.
That was one of my questions actually with your relationship with school. We'll get into that too.
It was bad. It was, do the absolute bare minimum to skirt by with B's and like A minuses and, study for the test last minute, get it done. And then thankfully tested well enough to like make up for the okay GPA. But I was decent at figuring things out. And when I was in college and I realized I wasn't going to get a job off of my degree, I knew I had to get a skill set somewhere else.
What did you study?
I studied philosophy.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. But I was really interested in entrepreneurship and I wanted to do a startup. I did one in college, took a year off to focus on that. It didn't work out, shut it down.
Startup?
It was, I was trying to, and I mean, I was so in over my head on this, but we were basically trying to do like Pandora for clothes shopping.
Oh.
So, and I mean, it's crazy because we were like, maybe 10, 12 years ahead on this. Because now with AI, right, this would be a trivial app to build.
Yeah.
But I had a couple of much, like actual engineers, and we were working on like trying to create a classification system for clothing so that if you were liking and disliking things, you could actually train the model to learn what you liked, and then it could feed you better clothing recommendations.
I want this app.
Somebody's going to build it.
I
like it's actually
so much
going to
time
happen.
trying to find clothes that I like.
Well, okay, so here's the thing: is a lot of people have actually tried to do this. There've been a lot of versions of it. Amazon has tried to do it, and it never works. And I mean, we were not a very serious attempt, right? Like, but the really serious attempts still don't work. And it's one of these funny things where everybody says they don't like trying to find clothes, but maybe they do. Right? Like maybe that frustration is what makes the clothes satisfying. And if you're just getting good recommendations handed to you, that's like dissatisfying in some way. Like it's odd that it hasn't worked.
Like people
Right.
purchase because they finally found
They
something.
finally found something, right?
Whereas
And
if
it's,
you're
like,
getting this
satisfying.
constant feed, you don't necessarily
Yeah.
need it, or it's almost overwhelming. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
this is all great. I don't know how to choose. Well, I also think to your point about marketing being word of mouth, like this shirt that I'm wearing, I got because a friend was wearing a similar shirt and I loved it. I was like, where did you get that?
Right.
And then I was like, oh, amazing. I'm going to go buy one too. And some of my favorite like new clothing brand discoveries have been I've just like seen a woman wearing something that I think is beautiful and I just stop her and I'm like, where did you get that? It looks amazing on you, but it's like such a pretty dress or whatever. Where is that from?
Somebody's going to make a version of this because I think with GPT-4o, it'd be pretty trivial to build, and like that plus Google Lens or whatever it is that you can take a picture of something and it finds it online. Like it's going to happen, right? But we were trying to do that way back then. And I mean, this was like,
I appreciate the attempt. Would have been a happy user.
Shut that down after a year, but then I was in my senior year and had no job prospects, and the startup had shut down, and said, okay, I need to figure out some way to get hired. And so got really into content marketing then. And that's when I started my blog and started doing SEO and started trying to learn all of these things. And in that process, ended up consuming a ton of information around like self-education and, just like picking up skills without being taught them. And I do think it's actually fairly simple at the root, which is just that you need to go find the bare minimum, like minimum viable amount of information to start doing it yourself, and then to actually start doing the thing and find a way to like get feedback on it and improve at it. And I think this is why programming in particular is so easy to learn outside of a classroom and so satisfying to people, because you can give yourself a basic programming education in a couple of weeks, right? Even if you're starting from zero, you could do just like some basic Python or JavaScript classes, and you could be writing little math scripts and things really quickly. And then all you have to do is start trying to increase the complexity, and then you'll run into problems, and then you go Google or ChatGPT how to solve those problems, and now you've learned a new thing, and now you create new problems, and then you look up how to solve, and like you just constantly go through this cycle of like create new problems for yourself, figure out how to solve the problems, and then your like repertoire of what you can intuitively do just slowly gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that works for most skills. There are certain things where it doesn't work. If you want to do rocket engineering, there's going to be a long research process. It's going to be a lot harder for you to just go start experimenting and screwing around. Like if you're doing like deep science, those kinds of things, this is going to work, or advanced mathematics, those kinds of things. But if you're trying to learn programming, learn marketing, learn entrepreneurship, learn writing, right? Like the worst thing you can do is, going back to Pressfield, do all of the things that are not the thing, but that are adjacent to the thing, right? Like a lot of writers go to writing workshops or meetups or conferences, or they take a bunch of online, courses and join communities and do all these things. And I just I hate all of that because it's not writing, right? It's like you have to actually do the writing. And then as you do it, you find little ways that it can be improved. And then you find ways to improve those little things. And then you just get better one little thing at a time. And you do that for long enough and you get pretty good.
You said that you were reading about or studying content on how to learn things.
Mm-hmm.
Were there things that were particularly formative or useful?
Yeah, in my opinion, the best resource on this is a lesser known but really good book called Peak by Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole. And the story of this book is hilarious because you've probably heard of the 10,000 hour rule from Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers. And Gladwell got the 10,000 hour rule so wrong. And it was based off of this guy, Anders Ericsson's work, that Anders had to go write his own book to explain what was actually going on with the so-called 10,000 hour rule. Because like Gladwell just heavily misinterpreted it in Outliers to kind of like fit that story. And so then Anders wrote Peak to explain really what's going on with developing mastery in a skill set and like getting really good at something. And it's based on all of this research that he did over his life across like chess and violin and actually early learning and just tons of area like tennis, all these fields
Mhm.
of like, why do people get great at things? What are like child prodigies? Why do people stall out and stop getting better? And then how can you actually design your learning environment so that you are continually improving and not getting stuck at these plateaus? And he's the one who came up with the term deliberative practice, which is a really common term today, but he's really the one who like pioneered that idea through all of that research that he did.
How much so you studied this in college and coming
College.
out of college,
Yeah, yeah.
and then you've rinsed and repeated it many times throughout many ventures in the
Yeah.
subsequent years. How much of it is super deliberate practice versus internalized habit when you discover something new that
Mhm.
you wanna start mastering?
At this point, it's pretty habitual because all it's like if I find something that I want to learn how to do, I basically know how to get started now, right? Like I find just enough that I need to hop into the first project with it, and then I start on the first project, and then I know what to do when I get stuck.
Mhm.
And the things that end up breaking that cycle for me are pretty much always one of two things. Like eventually I get bored and I don't care to improve anymore because this was like a shadow project all along and it's not really the thing that I should be doing anyway and it was just a way to like play a video game almost is sort of the equivalent experience. Or occasionally I'll hit a point where I really don't know how to get any better or what to do from there. And then I kind of like get stuck and abandon it. And so that happened to me with programming a number of times where I'd go down these programming paths and then hit these walls that I just couldn't get through.
Mhm.
And I would need to try to either like find a tutor or maybe take a more advanced course to try to like, build more foundation, things like that. And then I would kind of fall off at that point because I didn't want to take it that seriously. But with GPT, and like Cursor and some of these tools now, it's the most incredible learning tool ever because anytime I get a little stuck, I can ask for help. And the thing that I've learned with it, I was worried about this at first. I was worried that if I was always asking for help of GPT, I would get lazy and the skills would atrophy and I wouldn't actually learn programming. But that hasn't been what's happening. Actually, it's the opposite. It's kind of like it's giving me the answer and I need the help a few times, but then by the 3rd or 4th time, I know how to do it. I've kind of like absorbed it by osmosis and I've been able I'm actually getting better. I'm not getting weaker by relying on it for help. And that's been a really cool experience. And I've been using it for writing too because, ChatGPT and Claude are okay writers. They can do certain types of writing very well, but for writing fiction, they're really not good, right?
No.
But they can do little things here and there that are good, right? It's kind of like, monkeys hacking at the keyboard, like occasionally something good comes out. And so I've actually found that by prompting it the right way and getting feedback and asking it to generate things, 90% of the time it's junk, but there is a 10% in there where it's like, oh, I actually really like how you did this in this context. And kind of like with the memoir example of having a full story that's personal to you makes it resonate more. Seeing an okay writer spit out something good with your material actually does help you get better. And you learn to discern what you like and don't like, and you slowly improve that way. And so that's been a pretty magical tool for learning. I'm really, really excited about that potential.
One of the other things I think is really interesting about the story that you told in your book and the work that you've been doing or that you did in the crypto world, crypto is such a interesting manifestation of the wild west of the
Yeah.
internet and technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and the mania around it was crazy, which is a common thread throughout history when there's a new frontier.
Totally.
But it's so evocative of this truth that is so obvious about technology and the internet and AI, but is also so hard to grapple with, which is that it's just like such a great unknown.
Yeah.
And the edges of it are very messy, but also very rapidly evolving. The amount of innovation and experimentation and change that you describe in your book over the course of a year, where there were all of these crazy new things being created, and then, washing out and something new pops up and people are trying to like build off of each other and it's happening so quickly. It's really crazy to read your story about being in that. And I think it's also like you had the experience that I think a lot of people are very aware is maybe coming for more and more of
Yeah, yeah,
us, where, you know, finance being disrupted by technology is a really crazy idea because finance feels so static and stable and well, this is just how it is.
totally.
Um, and so many other things are like technology is encroaching, like especially with AI now. Like
Yeah,
you just talked about using AI to write novels. Like AI is
totally.
still in its infancy. That's crazy that it's even a thing we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are very afraid of how the future of work will evolve with this looming beast that is technology coming to devour everything.
Mhm.
And this is a conversation that I have a lot when I'm talking to people about building schools and developing curricula and thinking about educating kids is how do you prepare them for a world where jobs as we know them might not even exist yet? Um, and sometimes people's answers are just like, we don't know.
Yeah.
We're thinking about it, but we don't know for sure. We know it's going to change. You've been on the edge of that frontier. You've felt that and you've adapted very quickly in the face of it. Like you were learning new programming languages, you were learning entirely new skill sets to work jobs that like literally probably didn't exist a couple years prior, like doing types of things that weren't even possible a couple years prior. Maybe not, correct me.
No, yeah, I
Okay.
mean,
Um, my timing might be a little off,
it's
but
about right.
how did you think about navigating that and what have you learned from that and how, if at all, has it changed how you feel about the rise of technology devouring everything? Like you're a writer.
Yeah,
AI can generate text really quickly now.
I can.
How has this changed how you think about this?
Yeah, I think that it's the big question is this going to be like the other major tech breakthroughs of history, or is this one fundamentally different? Right? So you think about uh, electrification, right? And there were all of these things, right? There were people whose jobs it was to go around the building and refill the oil lamps, right? And when all of the oil lamps got replaced with electric bulbs, those people didn't become homeless. There were other manual type jobs they could do, right? And in some cases, they were better jobs, right? Think about like central heating, and now we don't need chimney sweeps. And that was an awful, awful job for people to have to do, right? It's way better that we actually replaced that and we're able to give them better jobs. And I think that there's been this trend of, oh, we're going to create all these new like internet jobs, all these new tech
Mhm.
jobs, and those are like the high status jobs. And now some of those might be going away, and I think that's really scary to people because yeah, if your job is to be someone's executive assistant or something, like that role is probably going to go down by 90% over the next few years because a lot of that can be handled by a good AI. If your job is copy editing someone's writing, like 90% of that's probably going to go away in some capacity as it gets replaced by AI. Or what's actually going to happen is people are just going to do a lot more of those things, right? Like a senior executive will still have a human EA, but now everybody has an EA. If you're a cashier at McDonald's, you have an EA because like an AI can provide that for $2 a month. Like there's this great chart about bank tellers where after ATMs got introduced, bank tellers didn't decrease, they actually increased because banks could like process a lot more money in a day. And so they could actually afford to hire more help for people who wanted more hands-on like interaction with their bank. And so it's really hard to predict in what way these things will go. But the best way I think to have a good amount of like perpetual job security is to just always be really curious about what the new thing is and to see if there is any way that you can use it to enhance what you're already doing, right? If you're a writer or an editor, you should be using AI every day to see if there are ways it can improve your workflow. And you might find that it can't, you might find that it's useless, you might find that it's really useful. But it's as long as you're up on what's going on, then you're creating some security for yourself, because it might be that one editor can do the job of 10 with a really trained set of models around how they edit books. Like, that future seems very reasonable to me. It also seems very reasonable that one writer could write a book and then have it automatically turned into a really richly narrated audiobook with sound effects and all of these things. Like, that's where Audible is going. Like, I just got an ad the other day for 1984 read by Andrew Garfield with who played Bane in Batman, and he was in Dunkirk.
I'm terrible at acting.
I know. Anyway, Tom Hardy.
Oh,
Tom Hardy.
Okay.
Doing the voice of Big Brother, right? And a ton of like cinematic music and all of this stuff. And I thought, that's so cool. That's such a cool way to do an audiobook. And that's definitely coming, right? Like, when you get the audiobook of Red Rising, it'll probably be largely AI voices with cinematic sound effects and all of this stuff. But there will probably still be a human director or producer who's kind of like overseeing it and listening through it and making tweaks and edits and like guiding it and doing all of that, right? Like, there's going to be a lot of that. And there are going to be people with voices we recognize and like who can license their voice to these automatic generations. Reid Hoffman has a book coming out on AI where for the audiobook, he trained an AI model on his voice and then had the AI model do the audiobook. And it's basically indistinguishable from him. It's really, really, really neat stuff. And I think, a lot of that's where a lot of these things are going to go. And so you can't really predict what the jobs are going to be and whether your job as it is right now is still going to be a thing. But you can definitely know that if you're on top of it, you'll have the competitive advantage over all the people who aren't. And as long as you're willing to like be flexible and keep learning, you can probably make the most of it, right? Like, it is scary, but it's also this huge opportunity where you might actually be on the cusp of being able to, 10x what you can do with the same amount of work in terms of creating additional media and things like that, or making it better, improving it. The amount of editing I can do with AI now is incredible. Like, I never could have done that a few years ago. And that's super exciting, but I still have to sit down and write every day. And like, that's really the competitive advantage, is sitting at the computer and doing the work. And so I think that's the other side of it, is figure out what's not going to go away, what's not going to change. And your ability to sit down and be creative every day, every morning on a schedule nonstop for years and years and years. A computer's not really going to be able to replace that, no matter how good I think the models get, because somebody is still going to have to like be a bit of the force behind them. And so as long as you can build that habit of like being that creative force, you're going to find a way to direct that no matter what the actual landscape of the tools is.
You talk about the importance of being curious.
Yeah.
Were you always a curious person? You said you hated school. Were you a curious kid?
Yeah. I was a really curious kid, and I hated school because it just seemed slow, and because they were trying to make me care about things I didn't care about, and trying to act like things were really important that I didn't think were important. Right? Like, they never did a good job of explaining why I should care about European history.
Well, it's a captive audience. You don't have to do sales when it's a monopoly.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, so if there was a class that I was really interested in, I would be the top of the class, right? I would do exceptionally well at it. But if it wasn't really interesting, I would do the bare minimum, right? That was really the two modes that I had. And I'm kind of still that way, right? Like, if I really, really am into something, I'll do really, really well at it. And I think I have a chance of being like somebody really great at it. But if I don't love it that much, I'm going to be pretty mediocre and put it off until the last minute. And I think it's actually kind of a competitive advantage, because there's this great article called like, what is the title? It's something like whole-assing it with everything you've got. The actual premise is that you should half-ass more things, because so many people try to whole-ass everything. They try to get an A+ on everything they do, and that's actually a huge mistake, because then you're wasting tons of energy on things that you shouldn't be spending energy on, because they don't really matter to you. It doesn't really matter if they're done that well. And you're losing energy that you could be spending on the one thing that you should whole ass with everything you've got. And I think it's, that's a hard mentality to adopt if you were a straight A student, if you were a really good, like, gold star performer type, But if you do want to do, I think, great work in some domain, you have to be willing to say no to a lot of other things, let a lot of other things go, and even like let people down in light ways in other areas, right? Like not, a close friend or something, but if somebody is like, hey, can you help me on this thing? And that's like not your main thing, you have to be willing to say like no, or I can, but like, I'm gonna have to kind of like speed through it. Or, like you can't try to be the best at everything because then you'll just be mediocre at everything.
That's also, I think, a thing that requires a lot of self-awareness and honesty.
Yeah.
Because it could also be very easy to justify half-assing things because you're like, well, this isn't my important thing, even though it is, in the vein of the shadow career again.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of, there's kind of like this people-pleasing element that goes into it where a lot of, I think, the trying to whole ass everything, trying to get the A+ on everything is you really, really, really want to be seen as capable, want to be seen as smart and helpful. You don't want to let anybody down. And even saying no, even though saying no is sometimes like the way you let somebody down the least, right? By just being really clear, like, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. That's actually way better than saying yes and doing a shitty job or needing to be chased around for it, right? But a lot of us do want to always be helpful and like always people please and whatnot. And so we say yes to all these things and then we get overwhelmed by all these commitments and then we end up doing poorly on all of them, or we do excellent on all of them, but now we've neglected the main thing we were supposed to be focusing on. I mean, it's hard, right? But especially now, I mean, God, it would have been so much easier to do some of this stuff if you were literally just in your house with no TV and no social media, and all you had to do was write. And like maybe you saw a friend for dinner because they came over on horseback and like knocked at your door and wanted to hang out, but you didn't have 100 text messages you had to respond to and a few dozen emails and like Twitter mentions and all of this stuff where it feels like you're constantly getting pulled into like the flow of what other people want you to do with their time. Like that balance is really hard today. And I still don't totally know what the answer is.
I do actually wonder about those sometimes. Like, was it easier to be creative when you had fewer distractions on your time?
It had to have been, right? I guess you had less inputs, right? So you had fewer things stimulating you.
Yeah.
But maybe human nature is procrastination. And so they found plenty of ways to goof off and procrastinate too. Like I could totally believe that.
Because I feel like also like you had to expend more energy to cover your base necessities.
That's certainly true. Yeah, yeah.
So maybe that takes a place. It's less distracting of your energy in terms of like little pings on your attention. But it's also in some ways like more stressful pulls on your attention.
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, you had to worry more about eating, right? Way more of your income went to food and stuff back then. It's not like there were a lot more writers or artists back then. That certainly increased substantially in recent history, probably because there's more ways to make money from it now too. But
I saw some really funny, I think it was a tweet a couple of weeks ago. I don't remember where I saw this, but it was something along the lines of philosophy nowadays is somebody writing a thesis that's like, I referenced this study and this study and this study, and it's all like, peer reviewed, and you have to, it's written to get somebody's mark of approval, and it's covering some very small aspect of philosophy. And they're like, philosophy used to be somebody would just write, I was lying in my bathtub and I just came up with like a theory of morality and our place in the universe. And it was this very sweeping philosophical take on the state of humanity as a whole. And those are the books that are like became a core part of the underpinnings of how thought has developed throughout centuries. I thought it was it was very amusingly written, but it was actually a very apt observation.
Totally. And it kind of like what we were saying with memoir stuff earlier, right? Like a lot of those older philosophical texts, they had this structure where it was just the author arguing for the first 2/3 of the book or for the first half of the book. And then there was another quarter of them explaining why everybody else around their time period was wrong. And then there was a quarter like summing it back up at the end. And like, honestly, that's kind of a great structure because at no point would they say, they wouldn't say, like, my research has shown or studies have demonstrated or whatnot.
It was all anecdotal.
Yeah, they'd be like, you walk into the plaza and you see everybody diverted by, all these distractions and whatnot. And you know that like the base nature of man is entertainment and not productivity. Or like they would just say stuff like that. And you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like that's all you need. Right. And I feel like we could see a little more of a return to something like that in some of this nonfiction. I hope so, at least. I find that a lot more entertaining. I think this is what Nassim Taleb did so well. Because if you read, Fooled by Randomness was a lot more data driven, but then Black Swan and especially Anti-Fragile was much more just, this is my opinion, take it or leave it. And there is something refreshing about that.
Well, I feel like a lot of people expend that energy now on their Twitter feeds.
Yes,
it is.
Sure.
It is like 50%. This is what I observe in the world, and 25%. This is why everybody else is wrong, and then 25%. Here's what you can actually do about it. But it all just gets diluted by in these little short form pings on people's attention.
This has been my growing crusade over the last year, is that I just want to get everybody who's wasting time crafting Twitter posts to actually try to write a book or something.
You are welcome to crusade this in my direction.
There's a lot of good writers on Twitter. A lot of people writing good stuff on Twitter. And that stuff's dying. Like it's never going to be resurfaced. It's never going to come back. Like every minute you're spending crafting a tweet is basically just like dead time, right? Like it might give you a little bit of a Twitter audience, but you're building a Twitter audience for people who read stuff on Twitter. You're not building a Twitter audience of people who read books or who, maybe like would buy your product or any of these things. And you see this pretty often, that people who build these big social media audiences and then try to turn them into something else, it often doesn't go that well because people followed you for these like, short digest things. They weren't there for like the long thoughts. And it turns out that like just writing short tweets doesn't pay very well. It pays a bit better now, but and so there are all these people who are getting better and better at that kind of writing. But that kind of writing actually makes it harder to do the book kind of writing. It's a total rewiring of your writing style and like your brain, your relationship with dopamine, and all of these things. And so the more time you're putting in there, the worse you're getting over here. But this is the one where your writing could actually have some longevity. So yeah, I want more people doing Twitter threads to actually like try to write a book or something, because I think there'd be some good ones that come out of it.
How did you rewire the dopamine part?
Oh, that was so hard. That was so miserable. Yeah, the first year was really, really depressing. I was really
the first year. This is not how you sell Twitter people on writing books.
I know. Well, it's better that they know what they're in for. I just like, because I set a schedule and I said, okay, I'm going to try to write 2,000 words a day, and I'll find, I tried different times of day. I tried early morning, tried evening, whatever.
What did you land on?
I actually found the best was like 9:30 to noon for me. So early morning, I wasn't awake enough for it to be good. Late at night, I was a little too tired. Afternoon was hard because things would crop up. And so like getting our eldest daughter off to preschool and then settling into work, usually going to a coffee shop. Now I have an office, but getting somewhere out of the house and sitting down and saying, I can't get up until I get this milestone done, which was usually 2,000 words, or getting through 4,000 words of editing, right? Like one of those two, like that was the rule. And that worked great. But when your brain has rotted from a decade of getting immediate likes and replies and emails about how smart and insightful you are, writing alone in the dark for months and months and months and months and months, it drives you crazy. It's really, really challenging because I wasn't getting any of that feedback. And so I'm just sitting there looking at it thinking, this isn't good. I don't know how to make it good. I'm feeling really stuck on this. And that went on for like 8 or 9 months until I finally took some of what I had done and sent it to my editor and said, hey, like, is there anything here? And he was like, yeah, actually, this is pretty good. Like, it's like, you're off to a good start, right? Like, obviously it needs work, but you're going in the right direction. And I mean, that was a huge relief. So that was the first thing I learned, was getting more feedback earlier really helps. But honestly, the other thing that I did is I just accepted that I need the dopamine hit. And when I finished Crypto Confidential and turned it in, and when I was in between drafts on the sci-fi novel, I hacked together an iPhone app for tracking my writing as if it was Strava. And so I could just put in how many words I wrote each day and like what I was working on, which project and things. And then it goes out to a social feed. And so other writers can like follow, what people are writing that day and like it and comment on it. And this is like my stupid way to give myself credit for writing every day without having to actually publish something. And it kind of works. Like it it gives me the dopamine hit. So that's actually been helpful now. I wish I had it a year ago. I don't know why nobody else has made this. It's one of those stupid things where if somebody else made this app, I'd be totally happy to shut it down and just let them do it. But no one else has made it. So I just used ChatGPT and hacked it together, and I like having it. It's
That's
helped.
amazing. Is this like a public app that people who are writing can use?
Yes. So it's on test flight. So I've got if you go to letsbeprolific.com, it's a Google, it's literally a Google sheet, or not a Google sheet, a Google form that you put in your email, and then you get an automated email from me inviting you to install the app. And then you can use it. Cool. And then it works. And like it's got the basic social features. It's a little buggy, but it works. And I'm going to actually put it on the App Store eventually when I have some downtime. But it was like, I need some way to feel like I need some way to feel like other people know I'm making progress. That sounds bad, but I do. Like, that's just, I don't know, the dopamine world we live in. And instead of beating myself up and being like, no, you should get over it, and you don't need social validation, like, you're better than that. just lean into it, right? Like, it feels good to get some kudos for going for that run or getting that writing done. That was the hardest adjustment for sure.
You still use social media.
I do.
How do you think about like managing your social media usage, or like your split of time between different types of work?
Yeah, I'm really just on Twitter. I get on Instagram a little bit to post stuff to keep that following alive, but it's not where I hang out. And the thing with Twitter is it's half community for me and half business. And I've never taken my Twitter super seriously. So, it's very casual for me. The thing that I've tried to think about more now, and that I really, really like, is this idea from Balaji Srinivasan in Eric Jorgensen's book, The Anthology of Balaji. And I think it's a chapter or part of a chapter where he says that you should try to win off Twitter and then report back on Twitter. Whereas a lot of people are trying to win on Twitter. And the thing that you want to win out of life is not Twitter, is not Instagram. It's probably something else. You want to build a business. You want to build a podcast. You want to write a book. You want to do all these things. And so you should go do that thing. And then as you make progress on that thing, or as something happens in that thing, you announce it and share it or whatever on the social media. And to me, that balance has worked a lot better. And so I don't do Twitter threads very often, or Twitter posts on like how to write, or, like how to market your book or anything like that. Most of what I post now is some sort of status update, or like, hey, I finished the first draft of the sci-fi novel. Like, hey, I'm recording the audiobook for Crypto Confidential this week. Like, hey, this person are Crypto Confidential and had this nice thing to say about it, which is letting me market the book. It's putting it back in people's feeds, but it's not me being like, here are 10 incredible things you'll learn by picking up this book, right? Which is a very different style of post that I don't want to try to optimize for.
You had a really great tweet that I have been dying to ask you about for months.
All right.
I'm going to butcher the paraphrase, but basically the gist was that instead of just paying for kids' college, more parents should offer their kids patronages. Can we talk about this?
Totally.
This is such a cool idea.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Well, it came from a couple of things. One, our oldest daughter is 2.5, our youngest is 1. And so we've obviously thought about opening a 529 plan for them. And for our generation, it was a no-brainer, right? It was basically everybody went to college. College was expensive. And if you wanted to save for it, a 529 plan made a lot of sense because it's tax advantaged. You could roll it over to the next kid if the whole thing didn't get used, right? It was like, obviously you did that. But for my kids, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, based on how colleges are increasing in costs right now, in 16 years, college will easily cost upwards of 600, 700 grand for like a private school, right? An expensive one. In state, obviously, it'd be a lot cheaper. There'd be ways around like whatnot. But if you say you're going to pay full price, right? So like I went to Carnegie Mellon, and CMU now is $82K a year.
It's insane.
Absurd. It's not worth a fraction of that. like it's a great school, it's like top 25 or something, right? And like, there's no way that you couldn't learn all of these things better for less than 400 grand,
Yeah,
right?
you can learn all of them for free. And some
Yeah,
of the, like the best courses or the best universities give their courses away. You can go
totally,
through the entire MIT curriculum
totally.
online.
I mean,
That's not what they're selling is
no,
information.
it's not what they're selling. No, what they're selling is prestige and access to prestigious peers. That's really the main thing you're getting from college. And so I feel reasonably confident that in the next 16 years, we're going to find competitive alternatives that solve that problem in new and interesting ways and that allow kids to explore their interests through some form of instruction and self-education. It could be a type of apprenticeship like we used to have. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of AI assisted learning that's going to be like way crazier than anything we can imagine right now. And so when I'm looking at like, okay, I want to prepare for my kid's future, but if I put it in a 529 plan, you can only use it for college. You can use like up to 10K a year for private secondary school, but that wouldn't even cover what most secondary schools cost. And then you have these big fines if you take it out and don't use it for college. And so the tax advantageness kind of doesn't make sense, right? And so at least for now, my wife and I were like, I don't think it makes sense for us to put money in here. And so, so then what do you do? And what we've sort of landed on that we really like is that each kid, by the time they turn 18, there will be some pool of money they can tap into. Probably like ideally it might be, call it 250 to 500K, right? I'd love to be able to like have that set aside for each kid. And then when they turn 18, we'd be able to say, okay, you have this pool to draw on for the next 4 years to learn anything you want, pursue anything you want in the way that makes the most sense to you. Like you come up with a plan and you present it to us, and then we'll work on it together and we'll fund whatever that is for you. So, they can't run off to Bali and go surfing, right? Like that's probably not going to make the cut. Maybe, right? Like if they're like an insane surfer and they're like, this is my only chance to go pro. Here's what I want to do for 2 years. Here are the success criteria, right? Like, sure, maybe. But maybe they'll say, I really want to be a doctor, right? The world needs more doctors, right? I want to go after that. And we're like, cool, like go to Johns Hopkins, we'll pay your way through. Like that's a great fit for you. But if one of our kids wants to be a writer or wants to build software or do a lot of these other careers, going to college might not make the most sense, right? I mean, so when I took that year off of school, I still lived on campus, but I was working on my startup. And so I was still in the college community while like doing this startup outside of it. And that was the best of both worlds because I wasn't wasting time on classes that weren't really teaching me anything, but I still was meeting peers and being in that community. And I just feel like there's going to be all these other options. And so I really like this idea of if you raise your kids right through their, like late single digits and through their teens and stuff, they'll learn how to like figure things out, how to do work, how to be self-directing, all of this stuff. I think just by nature of like how I live, how a lot of us live, and how we, intend to teach them. And so by the time they're 18, they should be fully capable of coming up with some plan and making some pitch and us working out something together that may or may not involve college. And yeah, if they want to pursue one of these tail careers like writing, your odds of success are low. But if you fully go after it for 2, 3, 4 years with some financial support, your odds get a lot lower because the reason the odds are so low are that most people don't fully attack it. And like that used to be what wealthier parents did is they like paid for their kids to pursue these things that they wouldn't have been able to pursue if they had to like just optimize for income. But now rich kids typically go work at like banks or consulting firms because they grow up with a certain lifestyle and they want to continue that lifestyle. They just want to like accumulate more money. And that seems like kind of a shame to me, right? Like give them the full breadth of options, like encourage them to think creatively about where they might take their education and then find ways to help them do it.
It's kind of like a personal family teal fellowship.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Totally. Yeah,
it feels very similar, except the pool's bigger.
Yeah.
You're actually offering them more. I know your kids are still very small, so you're in the early stages of probably thinking through this, but I would imagine you're thinking about sort of like the stipulations that you put on this of like how you drip the money out over time or how you're you're tying it to like performance metrics. Like I imagine there's going to be something along those lines that you're
Totally.
measuring. Do you have a sense of how you're going to think about that or not yet? You have like 16 years to figure it out. So this might be a premature question.
I mean, I think to me, the only way you learn is by actually doing the thing, right? So it wouldn't be like you have to read these books or listen to these lectures or anything. It would definitely be much more focused on, like, let's say that one of them said, I want to go after being a writer, right? And they said, I want to use these 4 years to try to get a fiction writing career off the ground, right? That would be an easier one for me to advise. But the year one criteria would be something like, okay, you need to have, like, I want to see a first draft of something in 6 months. And by the end of the year, you need to have like at least a second draft. You need to have contacted at least 10 agents. You need to have started building like some kind of audience of initial readers, right? There'd be things along those lines of actual proof of work completed, because that's kind of what's going to like eventually lead to them succeeding in it, right? Or I knew I had a friend of a friend who's he's a teenager and he's really interested in DJing, and he really wants to like try to become a professional DJ. And I was trying to tell him, I was like, look, you need to be putting something on SoundCloud every week, right? Like finish a mix every week and put it on SoundCloud. Like just that would be one example of like you're getting your homework done, right? You're completing work, you're putting it out there, right? It's like a podcast, right? Like you got to be publishing like every week or multiple times a week or whatever your cadence is, and prove that you can stick to that. And those kinds of things would be what makes sure that like the money keeps flowing. And there would probably be a baseline for living expenses, right? Like you're going to get $2,000 a month for probably less. That might be about the right amount. Like $1,500 to $2,000 a month for, rent, food, utilities, transportation, all of that. And then there'll be this secondary pool for tools, education resources, things like that, right? So if they came back and said, okay, here's the software that I want like a ChatGPT subscription, a Claude subscription, Novel Crafter, a few of these, like here's the total. Can we budget for that for this year? It's like, great. Like I want to take this continuing education class at UT on creative writing. Like, cool, that's $7,000. We'll toss that in the plan as well. But that's a lot lower than, $60,000 or something, right? But that one class might be really useful for you, right? Like I want to hire an editor to look at my novel, and that's going to cost $6,000. Can we put that in the budget for this year? Like totally cool, right? Like it teaches them how to use money, and it creates this like very specialized education in the thing that they want to do. And then I think what would be challenging there, that would actually be the harder part to figure out, is how do you recreate the community, right? Like how do you connect them with other young, motivated people? And I mean, for me, like Twitter's been amazing for that. I've met maybe most of my friends at this point through Twitter, or like at least a third of them. But there were some extremely pivotal relationships that came out of college too. And so there has to be some way to recreate the like high potential 18 to 22-year-old networking scene within a city, but I think somebody's going to do it. There's going to be something there, because I think the demand is going to be sufficiently high as the ubiquitousness of college as the next step when you turn 18 starts to wane.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I didn't go to college, and
cool.
I built a network through, also like Twitter was very useful to me too. The internet, like following blogs that were talking about things I was interested in, and then connecting with those people. Living in a city like Austin was very, very useful for me in connecting with people.
I'll also say that connecting with people your own age is overrated.
Yes, I agree with that too. The most valuable connection, I have almost no friends that are exactly the same age as me. There's a lot that are like a couple years older, a couple years younger, but the range is very broad. Like the people who are interested in things that are similar to what I'm interested in, or we just have really great conversations, are the valuable connections, and those have nothing to do with age.
Totally. When I took that year off of school to work on the startup, I was living on campus, so I had the fun party side. But most of the people I was talking to during the day were people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who were working on startups. And I feel like I got so much more out of that.
Yeah.
And it totally changed my relationship with school, because when you're in school, you think that school is really important and all these problems in your college matter, and like your fraternity drama and all of these things are like these big problems. And then I stepped outside of it and was in this other world, and it was just like, oh my God, none of this shit matters. Like, this is a totally fake world. Like, and it created almost like strains in some of my relationships on campus because people would get really worked up about this stuff. And this sounds mean, but all I could think was like, this problem doesn't matter. Like, I'm sorry, but this like drama in this campus club is like fucking stupid and you're not going to care about it in 2 years. And that was an incredibly useful perspective to get at that point. And to then it totally changed how those next 2 years of my like school time went. So yeah, it might not even matter to solve that problem as long as they have some way to meet other people doing what they're interested in.
Yeah, I skipped college to go work at a startup. So I was like, getting actually a startup that was helping other people skip college. It was
Awesome.
it was a startup apprenticeship program.
Cool.
So I was like, I had
It's
a
perfect.
built-in community from it was perfect. I was like, I'm gonna hack not going to college by going to work for the people who are like figuring out how to do that
Yep.
successfully, and it worked. But yeah, I've written about this extensively because I feel like this is one of the big things when people are thinking about education is like they're trying to recreate the social components of a schooling experience if you're trying to do something non-traditional.
Yeah.
And I don't think the way that we think about socialization in a like standard context is correct at all. I think we're operating on very broken sort of principles. It's not first principles thinking. It's like, okay, well, this is the like all of these other parameters have to be hit and how we're structuring this. And then the socialization just sort of occurs because of all of these other parameters that we've set.
Yeah.
And it's not, I don't think for most kids or especially young adults, it's like the ideal way to engage with a peer group.
Yeah.
I say peer in air quotes because not necessarily even like peers of your own age, but peers of like the work that you're doing or exactly. Like I don't think it's a given that being around a bunch of people the same age as you who are studying the same things is necessarily even like the right way to build a network.
It's maybe the worst way. All right. There's this great essay that I love to reference I think it's by Eugene Way. It's called College as an Incubator of Girardian Terror.
No,
And,
I have not read this,
but
this sounds amazing.
Piece. I think you'd love this. You'd love it. And the premise of the essay is you look at like Game of Thrones, right? And in Game of Thrones, it's not the peasants fighting against the kings and queens. The kings and queens fighting against each other because you always hate and attack the people who are most like you. And, and this has been like talked about for like philosophy for millennia, right? Like we find the biggest contentions with the people most similar to us. And so college puts together thousands of kids who are likely extremely similar. And so it just like hyper magnifies that effect because everybody around you is about the same age, interested in similar things, got similar scores on tests, probably has parents from similar backgrounds and similar works. Like you're all competing over the same jobs. And so if you wanted to drive somebody crazy by giving them no opportunity for individuality or self-confidence, that would be the perfect way to manufacture it, which is why you see a lot of really extreme and strange behavior on college campuses. Because if you cannot distinguish yourself by, where you're from, what you're interested in, your intellectual achievements, your athletic achievements, all of those things, if all of those things are just like table stakes, you have to pick something crazy to identify yourself with in order to stand out, or you end up just like hating and gossiping and like being super strung out and stressed all the time because you don't have a strong sense of identity in that environment. It's a really compelling argument. I really, really enjoyed it.
I have to read this.
Yeah, I think you'd like it.
This sounds amazing. I'm absolutely going to read it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nat, this has been so much fun.
This has been fun. This has been great.
Thank you for humoring all of my questions. Obviously, we have to plug the book, but I also want to plug anything else that you're working on or anywhere else you would like to send people. If people enjoyed this conversation and they want to learn more about what you're doing or get in touch with you, where would you send them next?
Yeah, so Crypto Confidential is the book. I've got, if you just plug that in anywhere, you'll find it. Most of my writing is at blog.nateliason.com. So that's all on Substack now. And that's like a whole separate thing where I wish we could still have independent websites for writing anymore, but nobody goes to them. Yeah. They just, we had to give in to Substack. And so it's on Substack there. You can find it. And then for anything else, Twitter is great. Just at Nat Eliason there. That's where I'm most active and will respond to things, and you can DM me and whatnot. But yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
It was my pleasure. All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.